It's the world's biggest UFO event after Roswell. A massive aerial object 2 times wider than the Burj Khalifa is tall, traveling through the air at a gravity-defying speed of 400 miles per hour. Thousands of witnesses watching transfixed as others grab cameras. Reports of strange experiences afterward, including temporary amnesia. This became the largest and the most documented UFO mass sighting ever recorded. Get ready as we uncover the unbelievable story of the Phoenix Lights. It's Thursday, March 13th, 1997. On this night, a man and his son are flying into Phoenix from Los Angeles on their private plane when they notice something strange right over the Sky Harbor International Airport. 6 massive bright lights flying in a triangular formation, quite unlike any other aircraft the two had ever seen. Not expecting any other plane within their landing path, the one flying the plane radios air traffic control to ask if perhaps there's another aircraft flying alongside them. To his shock, however, air traffic control has no idea what he's talking about. "There are no other planes besides yours," they say. "But there are 6 bright lights flying towards me," the man responds. Air traffic control still can't make out what he's talking about, so the man reiterates his report that there are 6 unidentified flying objects in the air with him right now. And with that, he begins his descent onto the landing strip at the Sky Harbor International Airport, after which he flies back to Los Angeles and promptly forgets about his bizarre flying experience. Now, the pilot of that private plane that auspicious night is no mystery. One and the only Kurt Russell. However, the lights he saw have continued to fascinate and mystify millions for decades. As a matter of fact, Kurt Russell's sighting was just one of 2 waves of mysterious UFO sightings witnessed by thousands of Arizonans and caught on tape by hundreds. The first wave happened between 7:30 p.m. and 8:45 p.m., and from the testimonies of witnesses who described the lights as 5 to 6 reddish-orange lights attached to a solid V-shaped aerial object, it seems that this was the wave that Russell saw from his plane. Further descriptions revealed that this V-shaped object was massive, about 1 mile in width or twice the height of the Burj Khalifa, and noiseless. From witnesses' vantage points, the lights would appear, linger for a moment, and then disappear, only to reappear in the same formation. The lights were also observed to be traveling southward from Arizona to Tucson, but by 8:40 p.m. thereabout, no one saw them again. At least not until about an hour later when the lights came right back. Either that, or perhaps these were a different set, which only made these lights even more mysterious. The second wave of lights was quite different from the first. While it did appear and reappear like the initial sighting, this new set of lights did not take the V-shaped formation, nor did they travel or appear to be attached to any solid object. Whatever the case, both the first and second waves of the Phoenix Lights were quite unlike any conventional aircraft or atmospheric phenomena the people of Phoenix, and indeed the whole world, had ever seen. So expectedly, the police and the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base at Phoenix got bombarded with calls from confused and concerned residents who needed help making sense of what they had just witnessed. Surprisingly, the Air Force was just as confused as everyone else. Speaking on behalf of the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Lieutenant Keith Shepard kicked public speculation into high gear when he told New Times, the Phoenix-based media outlet, that the base had no planes in the air at the time of the sightings. What then were these lights? One theory remains pervasive to this day: UFOs. Surprisingly, the speculation that the Phoenix Lights were probably UFOs of extraterrestrial origin was initiated by the military of all people. Let me explain. When Davis-Monthan Air Force Base was first asked about the lights, they responded by saying they had no planes in the air. However, 3 months later, they completely changed their story, claiming that they did have planes in the air that night, and that the Phoenix lights were actually flares that said planes dropped. To elaborate, there was a pilot training program called Operation Snowbird that was being carried out at the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, and part of the training involved dropping long-falling illumination flares. Everyday citizens, being unfamiliar with military paraphernalia, saw these flares and got startled by them, which led to widespread alarm. Okay, that seems simple enough. Except if these were just ordinary flares, and if the program was being carried out from the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, then why did Lieutenant Shepard, an officer at the same base, tell the press that the base didn't have any planes in the air that night? The whole thing sounded fishy, especially with the military's history of covering up the truth when it comes to UFOs. Case in point, Roswell. So, naturally, many came to the conclusion that the government was hiding something, and that something was very likely extraterrestrial spacecraft. The Phoenix Lights ET theory is not totally unfounded. Besides the military's shifty behavior when asked about the lights, there are several other factors that make the theory worth looking into at the very least. First, we have odd details in certain witnesses' testimonies. Secondly, we have the location of Phoenix itself, ranked 7th by the UFO Reporting Center for UFO activity. Then thirdly, we have the findings from spectral analysis that were carried out on the lights themselves. All of these factors put together seem to lead to the conclusion that these lights were not merely flares as the military suggested. At the very least, whatever shined over Phoenix that night could not have been man-made. Not with the strange observations surrounding these lights. Let's go over these factors one after the other. Kurt Russell wasn't the only highly credible witness to the Phoenix lights. Fife Symington, governor of Arizona at the time of the sightings, also saw the lights. And here's what he had to say about them. As a pilot and a former Air Force officer, I can definitely say that this craft did not resemble any man-made object I'd ever seen, and it was certainly not high-altitude flares, because flares don't fly in formation. This may seem too categorical, but the governor did request information from the commander of the Luke Air Force Base in Glendale, the general of the National Guard, and the head of the Department of Public Safety, but no one was able to give him any answers. And that's not even where things start to get odd about the Phoenix lights. This is. James Fox is a UFO enthusiast and documentary producer. While working on one of his UFO films, he interviewed quite a number of witnesses of the Phoenix lights, and some of the things they mentioned were quite strange. First, some claim to have experienced an unnatural reaction after seeing the lights, somewhat like temporary amnesia. They reported going right back to their lives like nothing happened, even though in hindsight what they saw that night was far from ordinary. Almost sounds like the case with Kurt Russell. Another odd detail in some witness testimonies was the appearance of the lights. Some said that the underbelly of the craft appeared to be undulating, making it look like one was looking through water. The weirdest testimony, however, comes from the National UFO Reporting Center. In a summarized report published August 13, 1997, the center mentions this. Hours after the bulk of the reports had been received at the hotline headquarters, we received a lengthy telephone call from one or more parties who claimed to have been potential witnesses to a scramble of F-15C fighters, which allegedly had intercepted the object over downtown Phoenix, photographed the object with gun cameras, and returned to Luke Air Force Base. The sources went on to describe how the base had been closed down, how the pilots of the fighters had succeeded in approaching to within 1 mile of the object, how their targeting radar had been neutralized by the object, etc. Moreover, they provided copious details about the incident, citing precise times, the names and ranks of pilots, contents of radio conversations with the pilots while they were in the air, and many other aspects of the events of that night. Coincidence? Well, believers say not. This takes us to the next factor supporting the ET theory, the location itself. The National UFO Reporting Center ranks Arizona 7th for UFO sightings in the U.S. Arizona has gathered nearly 5,000 sightings to its credit since 1946. In fact, Project Blue Book, the UFO investigation program carried out by the U.S. Air Force in the 50s to the late 60s, reveals that residents of Arizona, especially the city of Phoenix, have been reporting V-shaped formation of lights from as early as 1953. Residents would report seeing orange-yellow lights, as well as noiseless aerial objects with massive dimensions hovering in the sky. Some of them would eventually be discovered to be meteors or aircraft, and one time even a hoax. But others, like one bizarre sighting outside of Benson in the late 50s, would defy explanation, leaving military investigators to settle for a calculated guess. On October 19, 1958, a group of astronomers got together to catch a glimpse of Sputnik 1, the Russian space satellite, along with the third-stage rocket that helped the satellite get into orbit. It promised to be an exciting night for the group, who had set up their gear about 9 miles outside of Benson for the best possible view. Unknown to them, however, the night would turn out to be as exciting as they hoped, just in a slightly different direction. A short while after the group set up, something in the sky caught their eye. It was a brilliant ball of light with a yellowish hue, brighter than all the other stars and zipping through the sky at ultra speed. For about 5 minutes, this object made its way from the southeastern horizon to the north-northwestern horizon before vanishing completely, leaving the astronomers to wonder what exactly they had just witnessed. The bizarreness of this event couldn't be any more obvious. This was a group of astronomers out looking for a satellite and rocket parts. These weren't random everyday John and Jane Does unfamiliar with atmospheric phenomena, celestial bodies, or military craft. If anyone should have been able to identify this mysterious light, it should have been these guys with their sophisticated gear. But even they had no clue what this light was. Does this mean that the light was of extraterrestrial origin? Probably not. The Air Force did say that it might have been artificial meteors. But then again, that sounds like something astronomers should have been able to pick up on. Whatever the case though, does the mysterious Benson light prove that the Phoenix lights were extraterrestrial? Well, let's look at the third factor backing this theory, and it gets super interesting from this point on. This is Jim Delatoso. He's a CAD and computer expert. He's also one of the loudest voices in the camp that denies the military's explanation of flares. While Delatoso does not say outright that the Phoenix lights were extraterrestrial, he's unshaken in his belief that the lights weren't man-made, and he's got science to back him up. Here's how Delatoso explains it. Now, generally, most people use camcorders to record standout events in their lives. However, according to Delatoso, camcorders can do much more than that. They have the ability to pick up the finer details of a blob of light. And if you've got the right computers, along with the necessary skills, you could extract these details, analyze them, and discover the nature and origin of said blob of light. And this is precisely what Delatoso did with the video footage and images of the Phoenix lights. Using the software called Image Pro Plus, Delatoso determined the amount of red, green, and blue in the Phoenix lights. After that, he used the data he obtained to construct histograms, which he then compared to known flares. Delatoso's findings couldn't have been more revealing. The histograms from the Phoenix lights were significantly different from those of known military flares. In other words, whatever it was that those 20,000 observers saw above Phoenix on the night of March 13, 1997, they were not flares. Why then did the military claim that the lights were flares? Were those strange calls to the National UFO Reporting Center true? Did the Air Force really intercept a UFO that night? Perhaps they found something out of this world that they felt would cause widespread panic if revealed, and decided to go with the flare story instead. Was that what was happening? Or are there more grounded, mundane explanations for the Phoenix lights? Many skeptics try to explain away the Phoenix lights as an ordinary event blown out of proportion by believers. However, certain alternative theories like mass hysteria or false memories sound equally far-fetched. This does not mean, however, that claims about the lights being from outside this world are true by default. To begin with, quite a number of key witnesses and testimonies holding up the otherworldliness of the Phoenix Lights seem very shifty. For instance, there's no way to confirm the so-called odd testimonies from witnesses, whether it's the tales of temporary amnesia or the undulating underbelly of the object. And as for the intriguing call received by the National UFO Reporting Center claiming that the Air Force had intercepted one of the objects, the center did try to follow up, but found nothing. It does make you wonder why anyone would call with such elaborate details, including names and ranks of people, if they knew the details they provided wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. But that's a story for another day. Be that as it may, it's not the only aspect of the ET theory that falls apart. Governor Symington also turns out to be a less than stellar witness. First off, when news of the Phoenix Lights first hit the airwaves, Symington publicly ridiculed it, humorously mocking those who suggested that the lights were probably extraterrestrial in origin.
And he went to humorous and controversial lengths not to stir the pot. He held a news conference after the Phoenix Lights to announce the mystery had been solved.
And now I'll ask Officer Stein and his colleagues to escort the accused into the room so that we may all look upon the guilty party. Don't get him too close to me, please.
In the alien costume, the governor's chief of staff.
And this just goes to show that you guys are entirely too serious.
UFO enthusiasts were not amused, especially since the governor was believed to have seen nothing. But now he's coming out.
It wasn't until 2013 before he came out to change his story and claim that he actually saw the lights and that they were likely not of this world. Now, Symington claims that he initially denied seeing the lights because he didn't want to be labeled a UFO nut, which is understandable. He was governor at the time. Perhaps he felt it would not paint him in the best light. However, even his story when he spoke to UFO documentarian James Fox in 2013 doesn't match with the facts of the events at all. For instance, Symington claimed he heard news reports of the lights at 8:20 p.m., which was what led him to go outside and check them out. Right out of the gate, this is evidently false, as there was no news coverage of the lights until after both waves had come and gone. So that rules out Governor Symington and takes us to Jim Dilettoso, the con artist. Yes, con artist. Dilettoso's credibility is probably even worse off than Symington's. The self-acclaimed spectral analyst has used questionable methods to prove his UFO theories in the past, and perhaps for the entirety of his career. A few examples come to mind, but let's talk about the Billy Meier phenomenon. Basically, Meier claimed to have had over 700 contacts with aliens. He also famously shared photos of alleged alien women, along with close-ups of celestial bodies, and according to him, the Eye of God. Speaking on the photographs, Dilettoso declared that they were authentic, claiming that he had run some tests on them using sophisticated computers provided by De Anza Systems, a company in San Jose. The truth, however, turns out to be far less glamorous than Dilettoso paints it. When interviewed by journalist Cal Koroff, an employee of the company, Ken Dinwiddie revealed that Dilettoso indeed brought the photos to his shop. However, it was not to perform any analysis. Dilettoso had simply feigned interest in his computers and had asked for a demonstration. Specifically, he had given them the Meier photos and asked them to enhance them. Dilettoso then took a bunch of photos of the computers in the store and left. However, the company did not make any data interpretation like Dilettoso claimed. As for his so-called spectral analysis on the Phoenix Lights, that's even easier to debunk. Camcorders simply cannot record the level of detail that Dilettoso claims because of its limited lens. The average camcorder uses a lens that barely measures 1 inch across. That's not enough to pick up details in objects as far as 1 whole mile away. It's simple physics. You need a much larger lens or mirror, especially if you want to view objects as far away as up in the sky with any level of accuracy. This is why astronomers are always looking for bigger and bigger mirrors for their observatories, because the bigger the mirror for the telescope, the farther they can see into space. Besides, spectral analysis is carried out on the light itself, rather than an image of the light. Trying to do spectral analysis on camcorder footage is like trying to do DNA testing on the photograph of a man, rather than the man himself. Yet Delatoso claims that this is precisely what he did, which suggests that he is either deluded or dishonest, or both. Alright, so now we know that the extraterrestrial theories don't hold much water. But it doesn't exactly resolve the mystery either. What were those Phoenix lights? Well, as it turns out, the military wasn't lying, and the conflicting reports only happened because the wrong questions were asked. Let's tease this out. While most believers think of the first and second wave of sightings as one event, most skeptics are of the opinion that the two sightings are separate but connected. Now, let's explore where the evidence leads with the first wave of sightings. Although all kinds of witness testimonies about the Phoenix lights were carried by the media, one particularly interesting testimony was not well reported. I'm talking about the report of a certain Scottsdale resident, Mitch Stanley. On the night of the appearance of the Phoenix lights, Stanley had been in his backyard with his 10-inch reflecting Bosnian telescope, looking out into the skies. According to him, what he saw through his telescope was incontrovertible. Yes, he saw lights, but he also saw squarish wings to which these lights were attached, which suggested to him that the object he had just seen was a plane. In fact, so unimpressed was Stanley by the sighting that he said he turned his telescope to more interesting things after only about a minute of looking at the plane. Now, for context, Stanley's telescope used a 10-inch mirror, which is able to receive 1,500 times more light than the human eye. Also, the eyepiece had a magnification of 60x, which effectively brought Stanley 60 times closer to the light than others who observed the lights from the ground. So you could imagine his confusion the next day when he realized that people were making such a huge fuss about the lights and calling them UFOs. But weirdly, when he tried to reach out to certain news outlets about what he'd seen, most refused to speak to him, except investigative reporter Tony Ortega. Some weeks after the incident, Mitch Stanley would be interviewed again by James McGaha, an Air Force major and UFO skeptic. And judging from Stanley's description of what he saw, McGaha would theorize that the airplanes Stanley saw were very likely A-10 Warthogs, a plane that McGaha himself had flown while at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. McGaha explains that the A-10s were used by the Air National Guard, and that they were the quietest jets the Air Force owned, which might explain why witnesses reported the lights as being noiseless. The only question now would be, who owned these aircraft? Where were they coming from? What were they doing in Phoenix? And why didn't the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base know anything about them? To answer this, we turn to an article by UFO researcher Randy Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was financed by Reader's Digest magazine to carry out a full-time investigation into the Phoenix lights. He interviewed over 50 witnesses, including 3 pilots who were flying an America West 757 airliner on their way to Vegas when the lights appeared. According to Fitzgerald, the pilots had been a bit puzzled when they saw what they considered a strange V-shaped formation of 5 bright lights, so they reached out to air traffic control, at which point one of the pilots in formation, perhaps overhearing the exchange, chimed in. In the words of one of the co-pilots of the 757, John Middleton, the pilot from the formation had said, "We're Canadian snowbirds flying Tudors. We're headed to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base." And while this was easy enough to satisfy curiosities initially, exploring the story now reveals some holes. Yes, the Canadian Flying Demonstration Team is known as the Snowbirds. However, the Canadian Snowbirds were not in Arizona at that particular time, as confirmed by Major Jeff Young, the chief flying instructor for the Snowbirds. So if these guys in the V formation were not Canadian Snowbirds, Why did they misidentify their craft and mission? Or were they lying? But maybe Middleton was misremembering? Because there is an Operation Snowbird in the US. It's a flight training program hosted by the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base for Air National Guard pilots, specifically from the snowy northern states. So could it be that Middleton just heard snowbirds, and then knowing that this is what the Canadian Flying Demonstration Team is called, simply misremembered the event when recalling it to Fitzgerald? Because Operation Snowbird fits more perfectly than the Canadian Snowbird's explanation. Consider this. Operation Snowbirds is a training program hosted at Davis-Monthan, which would explain the flying tutors and Davis-Monthan part of what the pilot from the formation said. Also, it turns out that in 1997, the final night of training fell on March 13th. And if that's the case, it would explain why the lights were seen all over Arizona that night. Understandably, since that was the final night of the program, any aircraft that had flown off to, say, Vegas for instance, would have had to return to the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base at Tucson. So, reconstructing the story, Magaha suggests that 5 A-10s from Operation Snowbird had flown from Tucson to Niles Air Force Base near Las Vegas several days earlier, which would explain how the 757 airliner crew saw them. Then, on the night of March 13th, the last day of the program, they made their return back to base in Tucson. Now, one thing Middleton mentioned was that the planes in the formation used their lights weirdly. Well, since they were flying in formation, pilots wouldn't have to use the familiar blinking collision lights. Normally this would be wrong, but these were military craft, not civilian, so the FAA rules about aircraft lights and altitudes wouldn't have applied to them. Now, not many believers accept that the first wave of lights was just aircraft. Most maintain that the lights remain unexplained. Nevertheless, you've got to admit that the theory does have merit. Whatever side you're on with the first wave of the Phoenix Lights though, many UFO believers do accept the military's explanation that the second wave of lights was likely caused by flares. And a very strong support for this theory comes from Lieutenant Colonel Ed Jones, a Maryland Air National Guard pilot who was able to confirm that he was in one of the planes that dropped the flares over Phoenix that night. Jones also claims that the planes had in fact come from the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base on a training exercise, which solves the second wave of lights in a way, but still does not address one big question. Why did the government give those conflicting reports? Well, the most likely response turns out to be way less sexy than a UFO cover-up. First off, the Air National Guard, which threw the flares, and the Air Force have completely separate command structures, and it's not unusual for each party to be unaware of the other's activities. Interestingly, however, that period around March 13, 1997, an Air National Guard team had used the Davis-Monthan base for winter exercises. That team was the Maryland Air National Guard, and during their winter exercises, they did drop some flares around the southwest of Phoenix that night. This aligns perfectly with the news broken by the Tucson Weekly a couple of days after the sighting. In said report, it was mentioned that the Maryland Air National Guard had come to Arizona for winter training and that they had flown over the gunnery range with a squad of A-10 fighters and dropped flares. So, why did Lieutenant Keith Shepard say that there were no planes in the sky at the time of the appearances? It's simple. The journalist had asked the wrong question. They had asked him if the Air Force had any craft in the air, which was what Shepard responded to. The Air Force didn't. It was the Air National Guard who had planes in the sky. But then, why didn't Sky Harbor pick up on the planes on their radar? Well, a formation of military airplanes flying at high altitudes wouldn't have been monitored by Sky Harbor Airport. It would have been monitored by the FAA radar operators in Albuquerque. Even at that, 5 planes flying in formation is hardly anything unusual enough to make any operator raise their brow. In fact, on a radar, it would have appeared as a single asterisk. Not exactly panic material. So you can understand why more operators didn't pick up on the jets. Perhaps if any investigator had tried to request radar tapes of that night from the FAA's regional office, a permanent public record would have been available for us to confirm once and for all. Unfortunately, no one bothered to ask, and as of March 28, 1997, that door closed permanently. So, it seems the Phoenix Lights have been resolved, right? Planes and flares. The misinformation was just due to different structures in government and who had authorization to this information.